Hello, and welcome to another extremely provocative and informative AMET webinar. As you know, AMET is a unabashedly a pro-Western democracy think tank here in Washington, D.C. Every week we write and we publish at least one article. We are on Capitol Hill every week, and we have the wonderful pleasure of having amazing guests such as Ruhollah Mark Gerecht. Our members of Congress and staffers have grown to trust us and rely on us for up-to-the-minute valuable information. As most of you are aware, the Iranian regime is now being confronted with the greatest round of protests that it has ever witnessed since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The protests, which were sparked because of the brutal death in mid-September of the 22-year-old Mahsa Amini at the hands of the so-called morality police, because a few strands of hair showed out from her hijab, by now have extended into all 31 of the Iranian provinces and cut through most segments of Iranian society. As the demonstrators in Iran have now passed their 8th week, or the demonstrations, in Iran have now passed their 8th week, even greater and more sadistic brutality is coming out of the regime. According to the Norwegian-based Iranian Center for Human Rights, the regime has randomly murdered at least 326 people, including 43 children. It also has rounded up and incarcerated nearly 15,000 of these courageous, freedom-loving dissidents. Last week, 227 members, a vast majority of the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, voted to execute the protesters. On Tuesday, according to the Islamic Republic News Agency, the parliament issued a letter asking for the most severe punishments to, quote, treat them as though they were ISIS favors, to bring divine judgment to justice. As you well might know, the first of these formal death penalties was issued on Monday to an unnamed dissident. No one knows what's in store of these 14,999 courageous dissidents or what horrific circumstances they are now being forced to endure. Yet these courageous dissidents remain out on the streets. All of us owe a tremendous debt to these amazingly brave Iranian people. I honestly do not know what I would do if I were in their circumstances. We're extremely honored today to have with us Ruhollah Mark Gerecht. Ruhollah Mark Gerecht is a senior fellow at FDD, where he focuses on Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, terrorism, and intelligence. He was previously a resident fellow at AEI and the director of the Middle East Initiative at the Project for the New American Century. Earlier, he served as a Middle East specialist at the CIA's Directorate of Operations. Ruhollah is the author of The Wave, Man, God, and the Ballot Box in the Middle East, brought out by Hoover Institution Press in 2011. And the Islamic Paradox, Shiite Clerics, Sunni Fundamentalists, and the Coming of Arab Democracy, brought out by AEI Press in 2004. He's been a correspondent for the Atlantic Monthly, as well as a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Dispatch, and other publications. On November 2nd, Ruhollah, together with Raymond Takia, wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal entitled Iran's Hardliners Are Starting to Crack, which is probably the most optimistic piece I've read about Iran in the last 43 years. Ruhollah, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
An honor and a privilege. Ruhollah, you wrote towards the beginning of your column that even Supreme Leader Ali Khomeini's allies are distancing themselves from the government. You wrote, it's too soon to say the elite is fracturing, but it's clear that these divisions will widen, putting unprecedented stress on the regime. First off, what makes these protests today different from all of the protests in the past?
I think the most important element here is that the regime hadn't anticipated protests essentially being led by women. I mean, the regime's strength is that it has done a fairly decent job of assessing its own weaknesses and also assessing the opposition. After the 2009 pro-democracy Green Movement protests were crushed, that August, I think, in 2009, for example, the commanders of the Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basij got together to have a strategy session. And that session leaked. You can actually see video from it. And, you know, they did, if you get beyond some of the conspiracies, they did a pretty decent job of looking at it and determining, all right, we got a future course of action here. We can't do what we did here because we had millions of men and women on the streets of Tehran. And according to the supreme leader, they went to the edge of the abyss. So they decided, you know, tactics essentially to strike quickly, strike hard, strike lethally. They have not done that this time. And I think the reason they haven't done it is because they don't exactly know what to do when the choice is to kill so many women who are demonstrating on the front lines. You mentioned the death toll. That death toll is pretty small. If you go back to 2019, within a 2-week period, we're not 100% sure on the figures, but it's likely that they killed 1,500 people in 2 weeks. So I think this hesitation, which you can actually see in the writings, has to do with what do you do when you have young people, some children, but particularly young women on the front lines. They've had women before, but it hasn't been so defined. It hasn't been so prominent as it is this time, and they're at a loss. Like you mentioned, the 15,000 people. I'm deeply skeptical you're going to have show trials. I don't think the regime wants to go there. I think that could lead to even more violence on the street. What they want to avoid at all costs are hundreds of thousands of angry men out on the streets. And I think that they're nervous just about incarcerating people for any least length of time. I think they're much more likely to go sort of catch and release, because they are well aware that if they keep young people, young women, in prison for any length of time, their own thugs may rape them. And that is another feared catalyst. They have seen that happen before. And I think given the very delicate situation this time, they are loath to go there. So it's a bit of a pickle. I think obviously what they're hoping is by the relaxation of the hijab patrols, and in many areas of Iran, they've essentially ceased. They're hoping that this tactical compromise can somehow deflate the situation and that it will just go away. I suspect that won't happen. And I suspect this will be a slow boil. From the outside, at times, it may seem almost imperceptible. It may seem imperceptible from the inside. It's always good to remember that in the Islamic Revolution, you know, it took over a year for things to heat up. And also the regime has a very hard time dealing with this because it's leaderless. And that's actually a strength for the opposition this time, because if you did have a defined leadership inside the country, they'd be dead. They can't really locate it. They can't infiltrate it. I mean, Shiite regimes are always very good at locating charisma because they fear charisma. This time around, the charisma is sort of collective. It's sort of spread out into all these young women, and they just simply haven't figured out how to handle it. And assuming the young women are willing to continue to put themselves on the front line, I think the regime's in a bit of a pickle. It doesn't mean it's going to fall overnight, but it does mean that they're increasingly going to have to make some very difficult decisions and throw the dice.
But autocratic regimes don't go quietly and gently into the night. They have all the power, they have all the weapons, all the might at their disposal. They're not Jeffersonian Democrats. They can totally disregard the will of the people, and their baser instincts might come out, and they could just try to crush.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would expect in the end for something like that to happen, but they know very well that this is the type of thing that could bring on mass demonstrations that they can't handle. It's good to always keep in your mind that the regime it doesn't have that many units of what you might call a mobile anti-riot force. It started with the Basij under the guidance of the Revolutionary Guard Corps in 1989 in response to a major soccer riot in Tehran. It's grown since then, but probably, it's a guess, it's hard to know these figures exactly, but they probably don't have more than 125,000 men who can be deployed throughout the country and who do not suffer local affiliations, because you have to be careful. Sometimes you may be able to use local units of the Basij to beat their neighbors. Sometimes that may not be a very good idea. So it is really these mobile units that are the most reliable and also probably the most violent. But 125,000 men to cover a country of over 80 million people is a big country. Over 80 million people is very difficult, and so that's why the regime fears and has always feared sort of sparks nationwide. That if you were to get major demonstrations in Tehran, major demonstrations in Tabriz, Isfahan, Mashhad, that could easily overwhelm the security services. So they want to avoid that at all costs. So they have, pulled back their fangs and claws because this time they're scared. They're uncertain what to do. The supreme leader gave a speech on November the 2nd where he clearly revealed that, he doesn't want to kill these young people. He blames it all on the United States, secondarily on Israel and the Europeans, but he doesn't want to take this head on. And I think you can read between the lines, because by doing so, they could create their own worst enemy.
So what you're saying essentially is not that the regime is going to fall, but that it will moderate its response to the demonstrators.
Well, I think it to some extent it already has. I mean, it's moderated it insofar as what had been the pattern before. So, and it's sort of hoping that all this just sort of goes away, that it loses steam, in particular that young women won't come out and sort of spontaneously generate protests. It's certainly the regime is making tactical compromises. I don't think they're going to surrender on the hijab. I think that's highly unlikely. You've had very important members of the ruling elite who have suggested just that. That in fact they essentially give it a pass on the hijab. But I doubt the supreme leader is going to go there. One of the reasons they initiated the crackdown, I'm willing to bet, was because the hijab law, wearing hijab had become sort of perfunctory, even in the poorer reaches of South Tehran, which is, of course, where the regime cares about the most. What the elite does in North Tehran is of less concern to them. What the traditional community, which supposedly is their base, does is much more worrisome.
Okay, so do you believe that the Biden administration, after all of this huge display of demonstrations, will actually return to the nuclear deal, which would only lavish the regime with billions of dollars and reinforce the regime's power against the will of the people? The voice.
Well, I mean, I think the Biden administration would like to return to the deal, but the supreme leader told them to go pound sand even before these demonstrations started. So, my view on this is the Biden administration has made probably every conceivable concession that they actually can make. There are some concessions they simply can't make. I think the Iranians are well aware of that. So I'm kind of skeptical that the deal is even a possibility I think even if you were to go back to it, every month that it passes, we get closer to termination day, which is October. I can't remember for sure. October 16th, 2025. So what this any conceivable revived deal could even do, is shrinking and shrinking rapidly. So I'm not sure the administration has many choices here. It certainly, if the supreme leader would change his mind, I think you would see the Americans and the Europeans there quite quickly. But I think that's unlikely. I don't think the administration has any plan B. I think it's very unlikely that if the Iranians were to progress further, I don't think there is any American military option. And I'm skeptical there's an Israeli military option. But I don't know. They're at a loss of what to do here. They don't want to. I certainly haven't detected any desire on their part to, quote, interfere in Iranian society. So I think for the most part, we'll just be observers to what's transpiring.
Yeah. So I don't know if you're at liberty to say this, but since you had worked for the CIA before, is there anything that the American government can do that will help the protesters, in terms of being able to give them some kind of way to overcome the internet blackout, maybe small arms, anything like that?
Well, we definitely wouldn't do small arms. There's no way on earth. Nothing can be done unless the administration chooses it. The options that exist for the U.S. government beyond, the executive branch are nil. Things could be done, but it takes time to do everything and do everything, passably well. Just the simple movement of monies, which in and out of Iran isn't by any means possible. It takes planning. You could be sending money to the regime. So these are the types of things that, if there had been a bipartisan consensus to do earlier, should have been done. We should have gotten the agency prepared to do these things. The agency itself dislikes engaging in covert action. So there's a big historical reason for that. So it's not inclined to generate plans, ideas on its own. It would take the White House thumping on it, finally, to actually go there. And you also need bipartisan consensus in the intel committees. So if you're going to spend much money, the president of the United States has certain amounts of money at his discretion, and he can do certain things really without much congressional oversight. But in practice, it's highly limited. So you need to ensure that you have both intel committees on your side, or otherwise, of course, they can leak and kill anything you're doing. Most covert action programs need a certain level of secrecy to be maintained. So there's, in practice, reality, we're late to this game. So even if the Biden administration had a change of heart, some things could be done. You could increase, satellite receptions and all the rest. Iranians have a lot of, dishes, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of ways you could increase communications, which certainly wouldn't hurt. But Iranians are communicating fairly well. You can run a lot internally without sophisticated communication technology. There are ways to do that. What's impressive, I think, in Iran, and it had been a virtue for the regime, is that the regime isn't a classical totalitarian state, not by Western standards. So it has always allowed a fairly substantial level of internal criticism. Internal criticism that it would listen to. But the supreme leader has increasingly shut that off. He tried to, but even today, it's striking the number of websites, publications that are carrying serious criticism of the regime, and they haven't been shut down. And I think that's in part because the regime is uncertain it can shut them down. It doesn't want to go there. There's a certain disconnect between brain and muscle that in theory and spirit, it really wants to be totalitarian. But in practice, it isn't, and may not be able to. So it's a real conundrum for the regime that you're getting, increasing levels of criticism, both from individuals who appear to be loyal, that have nowhere else to go, who are part of the revolution, or some of them cases founding fathers of the revolution. Yet they are expressing concern, if not dismay, at how the regime has so far handled this women's revolt.
Right. Can you give us some examples of some of the founding fathers of the revolution? And I know you brought out several in your article who have actually said, like, well, let's hold off a little bit in terms
well, I mean,
of,
probably my favorite one is Ayatollah Sayyid Ruhollah Khomeini, who is, comes from a very famous family. He's still an advisor to the supreme leader. I don't think they're on the best of terms, but he's close to the regime. He's a real fire breather at times, particularly on women's issues. I mean, Larry Johnny used to be able to bloviate endlessly on the need to maintain female virtue. And he has suggested that, let's take a pass, a temporary pass on the hijab. And he has nowhere to go. Rouhani's website has more or less turned into like a poster board for regime criticism. Even someone like the Chief Justice, the JG, who is, I think, as I wrote, he's stone cold killer. He's going, wait a minute, this isn't going well. So, I think there's real trepidation in the system. If the women are able to keep this up, to keep putting pressure on it, to keep showing disrespect, that's I think what the regime fears most, is that there's going to be a seepage of disrespect throughout all the governing institutions, and that they could discover that most of the people who are actually on the gravy train of the regime actually don't like the regime very much. That would be the little dirty secret that might come out. And I think they want to avoid that. But if, you're having young girls who are flipping the bird at the supreme leader in schools, that is the type of rot that can spread through the entire system. It's a slow-moving cancer. It's not a quick-moving cancer. The only way it accelerates is if the regime, decides to take, machine guns to the protesters. That might work. Also, it might ignite hundreds of thousands of angry young men on the streets, and it could be overwhelming to the regime. So, they're in a pickle. It's a real pickle, and I don't think they know they can't recover the legitimacy. They know that what had been their base of support has eroded on them. That actually they knew in 2019, which you might sort of colloquially describe as the revolt of the poor. And it's very difficult. You can't locate. I mean, they've lost every area that had once been a very, an engine of revolutionary support of ideas. They have essentially lost. And again, the regime is fairly decent at chronicling their own demise. A lot of websites are taken down, but even the Revolutionary Guard Corps publishes an enormous amount of material showing how much people hate them. So it's something to see. I strongly recommend a book by Misach Parsa on democracy in Iran, where Misach, who used to be at Dartmouth, I think he just retired, had a lot of material coming from regime publications about how Revolutionary Guard Corps is having troubles with recruitment. Clerics are having trouble with recruitment. Women don't want to marry clerics anymore. So they are well aware of the distaste, if not right, hatred that has been there inside of Iranian society for theocracy for a long time. And what the death of Mahsa Amini did is just once again, bring it boiling to the surface.
So what you're not predicting like a 1979 immediate quick overthrow of the regime. You're seeing a slow simmering, like this might be the beginning of the end, a fracture, is that?
Yeah, I think this is the most, with the possible exception of 2009. 2009 was complicated, brought more people out onto the streets in Tehran, but the leadership of the Green Movement was essentially regime loyal individuals. So this time around, there's no question. Everybody in the opposition, which I think now is certainly the majority of the population, probably an overwhelming majority of the population. They're about the end of the theocracy. It's not about reforming the system. That really ended in the 1990s. Even in 2009, one could make the case it was conceivable that there were those who would support reforming the system. That's gone now. It's about the system has to go. Now the regime knows that, and of course, will fight even harder, I think, because of that. But at the same time, it's an irrecoverable situation for them, and they're well aware of it. They just don't know what to do about it.
Wonderful. Okay. Yesterday, two of your colleagues, Mark Dubowitz and Jacob Nagel, published from FDD, wonderful think tank, by the way, published an article in Newsweek saying, quote, while the Biden administration equivocates, Israel should seize the greatest opportunity since the 1979 Islamic Revolution for regime change. Israeli intelligence services should be the tip of the spear, using their power to severely weaken, coercively deter, and, if fortunate, collapse the regime. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's difficult to assess Israeli capacity. Some of the clandestine projects have been impressive. They've been of relatively small scale, and they've been very focused. Operationally, I think the most impressive was the heist, actually, of the archives. But that's a very specific project. It's not aiming on a much larger, scale. Israel could try to do things. I think it would probably have a decent reception. But again, it's tricky to do these things. It's always easy to talk about them. It's much harder to actually plan them out. And I don't know, I'm skeptical that Mossad probably has now the bandwidth to try to do this, which means if you want to do it, you need to get down, you have to start, you have to do all the hard work. You have to absorb the inevitable failures that are going to come with this. Agents, assets are going to die. So you're going to have a lot of compromises, but there's only one way you get better, and that is to actually, do it. Now, the Israelis certainly have gotten better than the Americans at operating on Iranian soil. So they've certainly learned a lot, I suspect, in the last decade. Whether it's enough to meaningfully aid what's going on in the country over, say, the next 12 months, I don't know. I would say it's worth a try. I just don't have a good grip on what is the realistically Israeli capacity. The good news is you don't. If you get these things up and running, you don't need an army to do that. It's a relatively small group of people who will be the brain center for running this. And if you can develop networks inside of Iran, I mean, those are going to be Iranians themselves who more or less supply and do the heavy lifting. So it's conceivable, it's possible. It's just, for me, it's a question mark operationally.
Right. Okay, now it's my esteemed pleasure to introduce you to and our audience to Karen Benjamin, who is our newest employee in MLET, who will be reading the questions that have come in. Thank you, Karen.
Hi, thank you, Sarah. Okay, so we have a number of questions here, a very engaged audience we are happy to see. I think the first question we're going to start off with is, does the opposition have a framework to take over, to like overthrow the regime? Is there a government in exile or internally? If so, who would those people be?
Well, I'll take the latter part of that. That's the easy part. No, there is no government. There is no framework inside the country. I think the ethnic minorities in Iran, which add them all up, are probably a majority of the population. Certainly the Arabs, the Kurds, and the Baluch have learned how to survive against the Iranian police state. I don't know if you'd go so far as to say they have a leadership in place. They certainly have leadership abroad. How that would play out with the rest of the country is unclear to me. But they do have some type of structure, some type of organizations with hierarchy. The principal and most important groupings, the Persians, who probably make up 40 to 50% of the population, and then the Azeri Turks, who somewhere between 20% to maybe even a third of the country. They don't. So there isn't anything in exile for them either. I mean, there are discussions, I think, afoot amongst some prominent Iranian exiles to try to develop some type of organization, association. It's hard to find the right word. Gatherings to coordinate, and to strengthen their voices. But it certainly hasn't developed into a government in exile. Now, I think you do see more commonality, a more maybe even go so far as to say unified purpose amongst the various Iranian peoples this time. Whenever, I mean, my experience when Iranians get together, certainly when minorities and Persians get together, and also even with the Azeri Turks who are in their own sort of class, you get a lot of bickering, you get a lot of infighting, a lot of disagreements. That may be less this time. And I think everyone's, the experiences they've had with the Islamic Republic have taught them the need for a greater common cause. But until you actually try to do these things, you just don't know how well they're going to work. And you don't see yet, really rich Iranian expatriates, of whom there are a lot, put forth their money to bring folks together. And until you see that type of effort privately, I don't think this is going to go anywhere. You're certainly not going to get Western governments subventioning any of this. So there will be no Western money. There will be no American money or French money or English money or German money going to help organize opposition groups. I think that's highly unlikely.
Thank you.
Did I miss part of the? Did I get all the question there, or did I miss one part of it? I can't remember now.
No, I think you touched on a lot of important issues that actually relate to a lot of the other questions that were asked. So you touched on this a bit, but I'm wondering if you could expand a little more on the role ethnic minorities in Iran have to play in this uprising trend, the role of non-Persians like the Kurds and such.
Well, they've certainly been on the receiving end of the violence. I mean, I haven't added up and then cross-referenced all those that we know have been killed or were the claimed deaths, and then looked on the map. But I suspect if you do so, you'll see the majority of the people killed have been amongst the ethnic minorities, particularly the Kurds and the Baluch. So, it's one thing for the regime to go thump on the ethnic minorities. It's something else for them to go thump on the Persians or even the Azeri Turks. So there is a easier disposition, you might say, for the regime to kill ethnic minorities, some of them. It's we just don't know. I mean, and when 1925, when Reza Shah, converted an empire into a nation state, a lot of assumptions were made. We don't know for sure whether the Iranian identity supersedes the other identities for all these minority groups. With the Azeri Turks, who are deeply integrated into the ruling elite of the Islamic Republic, the answer to that may be maybe. You don't know. But at the same time, Azeri Turks have stubbornly resisted the Persianization of their, territorial lands in the Northwest, which remain, overwhelmingly Turkish speaking. So, and with language goes identity. So these are some great question marks. I don't have the answers to these. And if a democracy were to develop in Iran, then you would have answers to these, because you'd get to see whether these people are all willing to work together. Compromises would have to be made. People would get to speak their native languages in schools. So, you get to see how it all shakes out, and you'd have a better idea of which identities are stronger and where compromises are willing to be made. But until the system goes democratic, you don't know. I mean, we do know there's a history of insurgencies amongst the ethnic minorities, but beyond that, at least for me, there are many more questions than there are answers.
Sure. I think we're going to shift over to the subject of Saudi Arabia in this whole debacle. So it's kind of a multifaceted question. Firstly, we've seen a lot of Iranian threats towards Saudi oil facilities. Do you think this is trying to divert attention away from the protests and towards the Saudi-Iranian conflict? And what does Saudi Arabia have to say about this whole issue? They also have extremely restrictive laws regarding women. So what grounds do they have to, condemn these protests if they have been doing that?
Well, I mean, you can condemn whatever you want. I mean, consistency is not a virtue anywhere, let alone in the Middle East. So, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the Iranian regime really hates the Saudis, and the Saudis really hate the Iranian regime. Part of that is the Sunni Shiite split. Part of that is the Arab Iranian split, and part of that has to do with the individuals involved and the history. I mean, there's no love lost between the two of them. I think the Saudis recognize the Iranians as a far stronger partner. And when the Iranians let loose that barrage before at Saudi facilities and also shipping, also against the UAE, the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates more or less went belly up. They didn't want to go there. The Saudi Air Force on paper is a hell of a lot stronger than the Iranian Air Force, yet you didn't see any Saudi actions against the Iranians. And I think that was quite telling. So without the Americans there in the Persian Gulf, I think the Iranians win that, and they win it fairly easily. I wouldn't be surprised at any time to see, the Iranians take another shot at the Saudis. It's hard to see how that's a losing proposition for them, unless it somehow activates the Americans. And it's not clear to me it would. I mean, that was a big change, Donald Trump, when he refused to respond to those provocations. I mean, to some extent, he, sort of put a a nail into the Carter Doctrine, I mean, which was already pretty weak, or was certainly ambiguous. Now we could, change course on that, but I'm skeptical right now that we would. So, the Saudis have to think about that, as does the United Arab Emirates. So they're going to do what they always do, which is try to placate those they are stronger in threatening, and they'll reach out to the Russians, reach out to the Chinese. They'll go where they can to see if that gives them any possible leverage against the Iranian regime. If the Iranian regime were to fall, I do think the Saudis and the Emiratis would not necessarily find it to be a joyous occasion, because if the Iranian regime falls, and they can bring about some type of democratic system, however crude it is, the magnetic effect of that on American politics would be substantial. And also it will highlight, as will the Iranians themselves, they will highlight the despotic nature of the Saudis and the Emiratis. For the Saudis in particular, it will highlight their rather brutal treatment of their own Shia. So, I mean, there are a lot of things that could come into play if the Islamic Republic were actually to go down and some type of functioning democracy to arise. Even if it goes down and just have chaos, the aftershocks of that on the Gulf would be interesting. It's the major immediate threat would be gone. Certainly, the nuclear issue would probably be eliminated, because I think the fall of the Islamic Republic would paralyze or kill the nuclear program. But there are a lot of angles to this that could prove to be surprising. I mean, irony is not uncommon in the Middle East.
Sure. And again, you touched on this a little already about the United States' role in all of this, but there have been a lot of questions about, one, what is the role of the United States here? Two, instead of what is it, what should it be? What could we potentially do to help? What should people advocate for? And the third kind of question with that is, how do we explain the intelligence gap between the United States and Israel? Because it seems that Israel has a lot more of a closer finger on the pulse to the situation than the US does.
I don't know if they have a better pulse about the larger situation. I think the Israelis have proven that they can operationally conduct themselves in ways that the United States cannot. There's no desire in Washington to work up the capability to allow us to penetrate the country in the way that Mossad has obviously done so. So you first have to have the volition. You're not going to do anything. You can't develop the expertise until you have the volition. What could the United States? The United States could do a lot. I mean, first and foremost, the president of the United States could actually use the bully pulpit all the time. Now, President Biden did make that quirky statement about, we will liberate Iran. And it's not clear to me exactly what he meant. He does have these unscripted moments, and I'm not sure whether they reveal his heart or just perhaps his age. You could certainly, at a minimum, use right away. You could start, focusing American rhetoric on the Islamic Republic. You could give up on the idea of arms control. The United States, even if the United States isn't going to bomb the Islamic Republic, and even if the Israelis are not going to bomb the Islamic Republic, that doesn't mean that you have to, lift sanctions. You can maintain a Cold War approach to the Islamic Republic. You can try to maintain some form of containment, and the nuke is a separate issue. So you have to, first and foremost, just eliminate the idea of arms control. That arms control is counterproductive with the Islamic Republic. So, and you need to, I would argue, focus on what is obviously a potential incipient eruption that could turn into a revolution against the theocracy, which I would argue is very much in America's interest. So, if you had a volition and you had bipartisan support, I emphasize that, it's got to be bipartisan, then you could conceivably do a lot of things in the country. You could start, working up networks to support, folks on the ground with money. That's probably the easiest. Harder would be, doing support for labor unions and all those things. Those things take time. There are a lot of people, I think, underestimate how long it takes to actually generate networks that can survive. But you can start. You got to start. If you don't start, you're never going to get anywhere. So I think there's a lot that the United States could start. You could have trial and error. You have to be prepared for failures. But you need to look at it long term. And that is, don't assume that you're going to have success in 12 months. Don't assume you're going to have success in 24 months. Say, the best minimum is going to be 5 years. Just pull that out. And you may get lucky, and Iranian people are the ones who are going to generate the clock on this. So, but in the short term, I'd certainly use the bully pulpit. I would maintain sanctions. I'd, just abandon the bloody idea of arms control in the JCPOA, and start the nuts and bolts of doing other things, knowing that they probably won't be decisive. All right, it's the Iranian people are going to be the galvanizing agent here, and no matter what the United States does, we may be able to aid them, but we're not going to be the decisive factor. I suppose the good news is given the way conspiracies work in the Middle East and Iran in particular, we'll probably get enormous credit for doing things that we never did.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you on that last point at all. I'd like to redirect a little to the current Iranian leadership. It's difficult to predict what desperate people will do, because often desperate people take desperate actions. But there have been a few questions about what they might do, such as perhaps withdraw troops from Lebanon with Hezbollah and bring them to help out with the situation. Is that something that's at all likely? If they had to flee, where would they go? And last but not least, what would it take for the IRGC to actually go and talk to the protesters and try to work things out?
Good questions. I start with Lebanon. Lebanon might be one of the few places they could flee to, because regardless of what happens, the Hezbollah is going to, at least in the short term, have a lock on sheer politics because they're so well armed. Now, in the midterm to long term, it gets pretty dicey, I think, for them if the Islamic Republic goes down. But no, I don't expect to see. Iran doesn't keep that many forces outside of Iran. That's been the genius of their sort of Shiite militia system, is that they don't actually have to invest a lot of their own forces abroad. So it's a pretty cheap imperialism. So that's why they're able to maintain it regardless of sanctions, is that they can't fund it as well. They can't do certain things probably, but they can continue to maintain this, these expeditionary forces, because, they cost relatively little. So I don't see any fundamental change. There's a real limit on how many foreigners they can bring in and whop, the natives in Iran. You can play little games and, have one ethnic group beat up on another ethnic group. But there's a real limit there. And I don't think outside forces will prove decisive in any way, and they could prove counterproductive. That's one of the reasons that the regime has its strong suit, is that there is no conceivable place for these people to run, really. They're not going to run to Afghanistan. That can't work. They're not going to Central Asia. That's not going to work. So, there are very few options. And, the Khomeini and his minions were able to appeal to the Iranian armed forces at the time of the revolution, before the revolution, and suggest that they'd have a new life in the new state. Now that didn't turn out to be true, and most of them were either jailed, executed, or sent or went into exile. So the folks this time around can't be fooled. I mean, I think they realize that the odds of them being able to have a prosperous home in a post-Islamic Republic aren't great. Now things could maybe change in a different way. Compromises might be able to be reached, but it's tricky. I don't think the Revolutionary Guard Corps can talk to anyone. I think that's a non-starter to begin with. And I think they know that. So now they don't, I'm sure members of the Revolutionary Guard Corps don't want machine gun women. But the Supreme Leader has been playing musical chairs with the Revolutionary Guard Corps since 2009. And I think the reason he's done that is to sort of, develop folks that have the right stern, stiff temperament to handle internal and to handle insurrection. I think that's why Ibrahim Raisi was chosen to be president, was because he has demonstrated that he has the necessary temperament to handle protests, to kill people when necessary. But I don't think the Revolutionary Guard Corps has any illusions about that they can work out some type of compromise with people on the streets.
Sure. Going back to what the Iranian regime might do, as I said before, desperate people take desperate measures. If they foresee that their rule is coming towards an end, they have these enemies, domestic and abroad, they're cornered. Do you think they'd take dramatic action, such as nuclear war?
Well, I mean, so far as we know, they don't have the nuke yet. I doubt it. I mean, the Supreme Leader, I think he wants the nuke. They didn't do this to just get close. But I think the Supreme Leader also knows he's made somewhat of a case study of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's not well known, but I mean, the Supreme Leader actually has a real fondness for European literature, and particularly more radical European literature. He's a much better literary critic than he is a cleric. So he's it's just, let's call it a hobby of his to understand how the Soviet Union went down. So he's well aware that nuclear weapons do not protect you from internal insurrection. So and now whether his conspiracy, which he believes sincerely, that the United States is responsible for his troubles, would be enough to provoke him into some type of foreign aggression or acts of terrorism are more likely. Certainly, if they haven't figured out how to build a nuclear trigger, they don't have a nuclear option. But acts of terrorism, I think that's where the regime often goes. I think, to use the French term, I think the regime, when it kills Americans, has a certain frisson. It makes them feel good. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that type of action, an increase in Iranian terrorist or paramilitary activity against U.S. forces, even U.S. allies. It's much better against Americans directly. It's more pleasurable. But I suspect that's the extent of it, because they don't have many other options that they can engage in. They certainly don't want to, really trip the wire with the U.S. Navy. They know how that ends. So I think they would avoid that at all costs.
Sure. Given the amount of time we have, I think we're going to answer one last question. But if your question hasn't been answered, or if you have more, you can reach out to Amet. I think we're going to end by this interesting question about apparently J-Post is reporting today that the Iranian drones found in Ukraine have Israeli parts in them. Does this surprise you? How do you think Iran obtained these parts?
No, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, when they first revealed the pictures of centrifuges and the hitherto clandestine facilities at Natanz, they noticed that many of the parts came from Boston. The Iranians are pretty good. I have to give them credit where credit is due. They're pretty good at running networks for the importation of what we would call illicit material. Israel's a commercial republic. All right, so it likes to sell things. The United States, all Western countries are, commercial republics. So if you can just work out a few cutouts, you can buy a lot. No, it doesn't surprise me at all. It's a delicious irony, I must say.
Oh, Sarah, you're muted.
So that brings us to the final minute. Thank you so much for all. This has been really, really very elucidating.
My pleasure.
You certainly know, having had been, I'm sure, on the ground there in Iran, you certainly know about what you speak. And I should make one final effort. This is a very, very important part of Amet's role. We really do believe that a well-informed public can help our policymakers make well-informed decisions. That's just one of our many, many functions. So if you would like to support Amet, we depend on our viewers to please support us at www.ametonline.org. And also, if you would like to support the excellent work of FDD, you could go to fdd.org. We constantly borrow from this wonderful brain trust that they have at FDD with wonderful, well-informed speakers such as Raoul Marc-Gerecht, and it was really a pleasure.
Thank you.
And I want to wish all of our viewers a happy Thanksgiving, and we will convene after Thanksgiving for our next Amet webinar. Thank you so much, Raoul. Yeah. Bye.